Something is happening today that hasn't happened in the WNBA in 16 years. Happy Friday and happy WNBA expansion draft to the Golden State Valkyries. Finally, they can get some players. I have Maria Marino here with me to chat all about it. The Locked On Women's Basketball Podcast. It starts right now.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm Jackie Powell, and as I said before, happy Friday. I'm one of your hosts on this program. I cover the New York Liberty at the Next, and I've covered women's basketball nationally at many other places. Thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by everyone at the Next, a place where we cover the sport all the time, and we tell the stories that need to be told each and every day. Subscribe now to support the staff at the Next that works so hard to bring you this coverage that matters so much. It is $9 a month or $72 per year. Find us at thenexthoops.com and subscribe. And remember, this show is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Also, your favorite podcast now has a newsletter. Introducing the Locked On NBA Daily Newsletter. Your one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That's lockedondaily.com and start your day with the new free Locked On NBA newsletter. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay, dear listener, last time we were together, I had Emily Adler on the pod, and we tried to understand how the Seattle Storm went from perennial championship contenders to under investigation and now having to trade their final homegrown star in Jewel Lloyd. If you haven't seen Annie Constable's great reporting on what the latest is in Seattle, go check that out. But now, moving on to what we are discussing today. Maria Marino is here to preview with me all that you need to know about this expansion draft. And so first, we're going to remind you all of what the rules are, how this works in segment 1. In segment 2, we're going to talk about which players could be on the move and what trades we may foresee happening. And then in segment 3, we're going to get into why there is not a lot of information out there about this expansion draft and why protected lists, which we'll explain momentarily, have been kept lock and key. There's a reason for that. It's pretty intentional. We will get into that. But anyway, segment 1, okay, Maria, let's start with the basics. What is an expansion draft and why do they happen?
Yeah, so I mean, really it's just to allow a new team to be somewhat competitive as they enter a league. You know, you want the talent to be somewhat dispersed, and the fact that we do have protected lists for every existing team, which currently would be 12. So 12 protected lists. It allows the teams some control over keeping talent that they are prioritizing for their future. But, even though the WNBA and pro women's basketball in general has been really overflowing with talent over the last few years. It's been a huge topic, to the fact that there were only 144 roster spots. The college game has gotten so much stronger. So there were minimal opportunities for players to break in to the W. That is going to allow some more players, the freedom to begin their pro career in the WNBA. Despite all of that, we can't just have, in my opinion anyway, I know some other leagues are probably figuring out other workarounds, but the idea is you don't just have a bunch of players that have either never played before or extremely minimal experience, like, thrown onto a team. You want the team to come in and maybe not make too much noise, but be a competitive, legitimate professional basketball team to sort of keep the overall integrity of the league intact.
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. An expansion draft essentially is a tool that the general manager of the Golden State Valkyries, Ohema Nianen, is using to start to build her roster. And I think it's really important that the listeners understand that the Valkyries are not married to any of the players they are going to pick tonight on Friday night.
Yes.
They are essentially, it's a stepping stone. It's a beginning point. It is a tool that helps this team get assets that they wouldn't have otherwise had. If you imagine, okay, the Valkyries are just going in right to free agency. All they have are, draft picks in rounds 1, 2, and 3. They'd be at such a disadvantage compared to other teams, right?
Right, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up the idea of this as a stepping stone, because that's what my big takeaway was when I was sort of reading through the rules that I could find and how this is going to work. This is just the first step for Golden State. This is the initial thing, but Golden State is going to be in on the free agency period, which is huge.
So I think before we move on to talking about some of the existing 12 teams and who we're sort of going to be watching for when it comes to which players join the Valkyries and which do not, I do want to make sure that everyone understands how this is going to work, who can be chosen and who cannot. So when it comes to the expansion draft, what's going to happen is Golden State is going to have the opportunity to pick one player from each roster.
Yeah.
They don't have to. They can pass if there is a team that does not have a player that they see value in. The Valkyries cannot choose anyone from each team's protected list, which we just spoke about. And so each of the 12 teams have designated 6 players that Golden State cannot touch. And we will, in segment 3, talk about why we do not know who are on those protected lists.
The protected lists are protected from all of our view.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better than that. I think it's worth also mentioning that the Valkyries can choose one unrestricted free agent, but there is a list of unrestricted free agents that the Valkyries cannot choose. So don't expect names like Brittany Griner, Neko Gumake, Tina Charles, Brianna Jones, DeWanna Bonner, and Natasha Howard being selected by the Valkyries in this draft.
Right. And it's because they were cored twice, right? So if they've been previously cored twice, that means that they would be ineligible. So it kind of helps give us just a little bit of clarity of, like, a little process of elimination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so also it's worth noting that examples of potential free agents that maybe the Valkyries could choose, folks that have not been cored twice. I think it's also worth pointing out before we get to our break what Richard Cohen at Her Hoop Stats reported. And so it's worth noting that the 12 existing teams do not have the official protected lists around the league, and they won't get to see them. So the GMs only know their own list. So when they're making deals, they can only really make them with the Valkyries unless they guess who is being protected. They'll only know
Right.
when the Valkyries select who wasn't protected, which is a fascinating layer to unpack. So coming up, we're going to get into the teams to watch out for, the rosters that we think are most fascinating, and some trades that we imagine might come out of this expansion draft. But first, I do want to talk to you all about our good friends at Robinhood. So with Robinhood Gold, you don't need a silver spoon to eat up the financial flavors or favors of the 1%. Robinhood Gold allows others to get the rates and perks usually reserved for the high society. Now the resources individual with Robinhood Gold can earn the very liberal rate of 4.25% APY on uninvested cash and be rewarded with a handsome 3% retirement boost on IRA account contributions. Robinhood Gold provides the privileges of a high net worth for any net worth. These generous benefits are now available for only $5 a month. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. Sign up at robinhood.com/gold. Terms apply. For product-specific disclosures, visit robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk. Rates may change. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold, LLC. Well, thank you very much, Robinhood. We appreciate you. And so now I am back with Maria Marino. We are talking and previewing all things WNBA expansion draft. So, Maria, I think where I want to start is, what are a couple of the most fascinating teams that stick out to you when it comes to, we could see some really interesting movement happen? I want you to give a couple. I will give a couple too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the most fascinating teams are the deeper teams. And so I think you have to start with teams that were in contention for a title. And one of those for sure that stood out to me was Minnesota, because they have some obvious players that you would want to protect, but they also have, I think, one or two spots on that 6-player protected list that are quite debatable depending on what their specific priorities are, which again, we won't really have a lot of insight into that process. So, there are certainly role players, and when I say role players, I mean players that contributed significant minutes while, Minnesota was seeking a title and making it to the finals last season, that are not going to be protected. I feel, just based on, again, this is it's like musical chairs, kind of like at some point, there's only so many. And so, someone like a Natisha Heidemann, for example, Maisha Hines-Allen is a very, I think, valuable piece. Will she or will she not? Dorka Juhas has shown some upside. She's been a contributor on this team. They drafted Alyssa Peely last year, who I think is very talented, barely saw the floor, especially later in the season. How about Cecilia Zandalasini? There's so many names of players that you either, maybe could see them as underutilized, but also we're quite heavily leaned on and utilized for a competitive team. That there's going to be decisions, and so if I'm Golden State, I am definitely who can we get from Minnesota? And I feel like you feel the same way when it comes to New York, which was the other team that was in the finals.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The Liberty have so many assets. Like when you talk about teams that were ready for the expansion draft and had, okay, plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, that was New York.
Yeah.
And so, there have been a lot of expansion draft projectors online that have said that the Golden State Valkyries will choose Kayla Thornton. And I think that is a very fair possibility. But I think what the Liberty made sure to do is to have players that can fill in some of those gaps. So I think it's worth mentioning all of the players that the Liberty have when it comes to their rights. So if I am opening up the Per Hoop Stats salary sheet.
Yeah.
So they have the rights of Maureen Johannes, who many people are thinking, maybe the Valkyries could choose her. Based on what I know about the New York Liberty, they are going to try to do whatever it takes to make sure that Maureen Johannes stays in New York, especially since she was not able to contend for a championship in 2024 due to her Olympic commitments. So there's Maureen Johannes. There's Han Chu, who was suspended. Her contract was suspended. The Liberty have her rights. Who else is on this list? Former unsigned draftees. Caitlin Davis, who they took in the third round of the 2024 draft. Maureen Fatou, who the Liberty took, I want to say, in the third round in 2021. And then you have Raquel Carrera, who the Liberty picked up that asset when they traded A.D. Durr. And Raquel Carrera was who they got in exchange. So there are all these assets, that are there. I mean, when you think, so if the Liberty were to lose Kayla Thornton.
Yeah.
Oh, and I forgot to mention Rebecca Gardner. She's another
right.
Who they have the rights to.
I think one of the most fascinating questions here is the Maureen Johannes question, because even though from what you're saying, look, the Liberty love Maureen. Who doesn't love Maureen? Maureen's one of my favorite players. She's spectacular. But I think there's an argument to be made that, well, if she's going to continue to, have these French commitments, could that be a downside moving forward? And then, the fact that the Liberty front office kind of, they really did well with the Leonie Fibish acquisition and development as someone who can shoot threes and she's better defensively. Like maybe there's a notion that, okay, maybe they don't need Maureen, but that's just me playing devil's advocate a little bit. I think it's really important to note that probably one of the most fascinating parts of this expansion draft isn't necessarily the clear cut, okay, these players are protected, these are available, and this is who Golden State is picking, but it's the manipulation of assets and the potential trades that may arise where teams may use their draft capital to try to convince Golden State to do something that will work in their favor, whether that means, like preventing losing one of the players that they want to keep, or conversely, maybe telling them or nudging them to pick a certain player that maybe it would benefit them to lose because of, salary cap restrictions or because maybe the current team doesn't see the fit. So like that manipulation of the deals that are going to go on behind the scenes is what makes this like such a chess match.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of what you just said, that brings me to thinking about the Indiana Fever. I mean, I will attach this in the show notes, but Kevin Pelton posed a fascinating trade that I could very much see the Indiana Fever doing. which is the Fever send their 2026 first round pick to Golden State. So that's not this year's first round pick. That's next year's.
Yeah.
For the Valkyries 2026 second round pick and the agreement to take on Katie Lou Samuelson. So Katie Lou Samuelson is that perfect example in that she had a very difficult time cracking the rotation. She did not seem to be the player that the Fever hoped that she would be. Yeah. And if you take a look at her hoop stats, the salary cap sheet here, she's on in 2025, she will earn over $180,000. That is a lot of money in the salary cap for someone who was having difficulty establishing her role either in the starting rotation or as a sixth player. So that's a place where I really think you could see teams trying to help themselves and help their salary cap situation before we get into free agency. We're going to talk more about what we don't know and why we don't know it in our final segment. But first, I do want to remind all the listeners about our good friends at FanDuel. So, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook of the NFL. Thank you very much to FanDuel. I am here with Maria Marino, and we are going to talk to end our show about why there is so much unknown. So, Maria, I have some reporting to share, but first I want to hear from you. Why do you think that there is so much mystery, that there have been no leaks up until us recording this afternoon, the night before Friday?
So this was reported some time ago that we started to hear that these, protected lists would not be shared publicly for each team. And I think there's been there's differing schools of thought on it. Partly, I think there is a viewpoint that this is meant to help protect players. And we keep using the word protect, but it's like literally and figuratively, because they're called protected lists. But, like I was joking before, they're protected from our view. But I do think there is a layer of, players can be vulnerable in this process, and that transparency can shield them. But the counter argument to that is, does it really protect the players, or does it protect the organizations and the owners more? So I think there's certainly a debate to be had there. I think teams want to also preserve their relationships with their players. I guess my initial thought was, well, aren't the players going to talk? But Jackie, help me understand, are the players even going to be notified themselves whether they are protected or not? Apart from simply knowing, well, clearly if they're, well, maybe not so clearly. If you're going to Golden State, you probably were not protected, but maybe you're also going to Golden State via trade, which I assume trade details would be revealed at some point in time. So I'm curious how that is going to go down. Like if a player is going to Golden State, via trade, will that trade, typically trade details are released by the team, when the trade happens.
To be clear, you were correct. Whenever a trade is going to happen, we are going to see the results. I was looking at a very old internet webpage from when the Atlanta Dream did their expansion draft in 2008. It was this old press release where it stated the players that the Dream selected, and then there was a section where it stated the different trades that went on also. So we are going to know that. But it's going to be like everywhere, everything all at once, because it's been made very clear to me that this information is under lock and key. And you are absolutely correct in saying that the WNBA's decision to listen to what the teams wanted, which is the teams wanted this to be private. And we have seen examples in other professional women's sports leagues where this was not private. This was public. And it ripped relationships apart. And it had coaches also crying wolf. And I'm talking about the NWSL. I mean, I will attach a link where it explained that Alex Morgan essentially called for expansion drafts to be abolished. And mind you, the NWSL did around, I want to say 3 expansion drafts in the span of 4 years, which is a lot.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I understand why maybe that leads to a bit of an expansion draft hangover. But then what happened was the NWSL's Players Association then got together and negotiated a new CBA, which banned all drafts cold turkey. So I think the WNBA was paying attention to this. I think they were seeing what was happening. They were seeing players really upset about, knowing who was valued more than who, and that being public. And there were coaches that were talking about the drama that resulted. There's this quote here: I don't think people actually realize the damage that is created by this process and what it does to players, clubs, and those relationships. And that was from the current coach of the North Carolina Courage, Sean Nahas. So I guess the W was trying to, execute some sort of damage control. I mean, it just seems like they know that the WNBPA opted out of the CBA. They knew they were going to. And so here they are trying to make sure that the Players Association and the WNBA does not try to abolish drafts. Because as we said at the top, we said that an expansion draft and even an amateur draft, those are tools that general managers and teams have. Right. And so by abolishing all drafts, you're taking away tools.
So when I initially heard that the NWSL was doing away with drafts entirely, I have to say it's uncharted territory for me and a lot of people that cover sports. I don't know a world without a draft, right? It's like such a staple to how sports leagues have operated. But I am intrigued by a women's league kind of really embodying the, hey, just because this is how it's always been done, in particular with men's leagues, doesn't mean that we have to do it this way. We don't necessarily have to follow the same blueprint that has typically been, the situation in sports. But one note I think important to point out, underscoring all of this whole process is the CBA that you mentioned, because you think this is madness. Like, we're going to have so many free agents going into the 2026 season because we know that there is going to be a new CBA negotiated that is likely going to raise the salary cap. And so players aren't doing long-term deals because they're like, well, why would I lock myself into something when most likely my salary is going to increase? So that's important just to keep in mind in the back of your head, like, this is going to be kind of a free for all, like literally. But just in terms of the not releasing of the lists and all that, I guess my thing is, while I understand all of those plights that somebody like an Alex Morgan was trying to sort of explain, it is also the job of the GM and the front office to communicate with their players and to, first of all, have them understand reasoning why things weren't done, and also understanding that it is another layer of the business. Like, yes, trades happen because it's part of the business. Who you select in the draft, that is part of the business. And you can take it personally or not. I mean, we love a good revenge game, right? We love various, motivations that crop up. So those people always say it's not personal. In my opinion, it's kind of hard to separate the personal part, but that's okay. It just fuels the competition. But what I'm just saying is, like, just in defense of this potential system, and we'll see how it plays out. Like, if this were to be public information, it would just be another layer that, frankly, the front offices would have to deal with more so, in my opinion, than, the players being maybe offended or some other, emotion. I mean, I know it's got to be scary. But a lot of these players, I think you understand when you become a pro that you could be traded. But I guess, to be fair, the lack of transparency, I do think it will shield the players in the sense of just general, like, criticism from fans and or trolls. Like, I think that it will kind of help get rid of some of that crap. So, like, I don't have a problem with it per se. I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm still sorting out how I feel about it. And I think that's fair because this is a new process for all of us. And we'll see how this one goes. And like I said, we're going to have a couple more years of these in a row to really kind of assess what's worked and what hasn't.
Oh, absolutely. I think, just to tackle a little bit more onto your point there, I guess what I compare this to is when teams trade players, right? When a team trades a player, the general manager typically gets on the phone with the player, talks to them about what is happening, explains why, offers maybe a bright side to getting traded. Imagine having to do that with maybe between 4 and 6 other players on your team, but you also don't know if any of those players are going to be taken by Golden State. I think it's just doing it this way. And I understand why, for us folks on the media side, why you want to, create more storylines, but I understand why this is being done. I understand that there's some control the general managers want to have. So it's like, okay, I make that call to one person instead of having to call maybe 6 people.
Yeah.
But then, but they're not actually taken. So then how in the world do they stand? You know what I'm saying? It's sort of like, well, I've just been devalued, but I'm still going to stay here.
It's a layer of complication for sure, but I think it's all about the messaging. Like, going back to what I was saying, I'm like, if these were public and the GMs had to manage that, like, just because you are not on the protected list theoretically doesn't mean that you're devalued. Like, could be other motivations, and it's about communicating those properly with your players. Should you keep them? Maybe it'll be moot, right? Maybe everybody's going to be in the dark. Nobody knows who was protected, who wasn't. I originally was like, how are things not going to get out? But who knows? I mean, maybe there's no need for it to get out. We'll we'll be finding out soon enough. But yeah, I think that's something to stress too. Like, if a player isn't protected, if they're not one of the 6 protected, it's like, if you look at the rosters, we talked about Minnesota as an example. I didn't even get into Washington that much, but there's 12 players on a roster for a reason. Like, just because they're not in that 6 protected doesn't mean they're not incredibly valuable. So
correct.
People need to understand that too. If you see a player going to Golden State, it's not like, well, that other team just didn't want them. I guarantee you they drafted them or traded for them for a reason. They see value in them. It's just a numbers game.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen today. And so the drama is coming, folks. We are going to be ready for it. We are going to be watching this ESPN special at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Friday night or tonight. Your favorite podcast also now has a newsletter introducing the Locked On NBA Daily Newsletter. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That's lockedondaily.com. Also, I want to give a huge, huge, huge shout out to Maria Marino. Maria, please tell the good listeners and viewers where people can find your great work.
Well, please follow me on social media at Maria C. Marino. But thank you for having me, Jackie. And this was a good excuse for me to understand what the hell is going on with this expansion draft.
Well, folks, this has been Jackie Powell and
Maria Marino.
And we are signing off. Enjoy the chaos, everyone.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every